The 2020 election was an unusual one for many reasons. But lest we forget, one of those reasons was that 2020 was the 100th anniversary of us women finally getting the right to vote. It's hard to believe that it wasn't until 1920 that brave women such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott finally achieved what they and thousands of their supporters had been fighting for. It wasn't an easy fight, and this centennial is the perfect time to commemorate their struggle. We say centennial, but the struggle had actually begun more than a century earlier, almost immediately upon the founding of our nation, in fact. Abigail Adams, wife of founding father John Adams, told her husband to remember the ladies. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Surprised? I know I was when I began doing research for this project, as I was by much of what I learned. Abigail was ignored, of course. And it wasn't until July 1848 at the Women's Conference in Seneca Falls, New York, that 68 women and 32 men signed a declaration calling for equality for women. A similar convention was held in 1851 in Ohio. And in reading about these two events, I learned how the fight for equal rights for women was tied to the fight for equal rights for blacks. Frederick Douglass gave a speech in support of women's rights at the first convention. And escaped slave Sojourner Truth did the same at the second. In the ensuing years, many citizen groups formed to advance our cause, and many promoted both causes simultaneously. Here's a photo of a group of women suffragists that appeared in a magazine in 1915. Here's a photo from the March 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. All of the 8,000 women who marched dressed in long white gowns, and you can see the garland that connected them, symbolizing the chains they were bound by. Trivia time. What was the first state in the Union to grant women the right to vote? On September 6, 1870, Louisa Ann Gardner Swain became the first woman in America to cast a vote in Laramie, Wyoming. On Inauguration Day in 1917, suffragists circled the White House for 2 hours in pouring rain to get the attention of President Woodrow Wilson. Many suffragists were arrested and suffered what can only be described as cruel and unusual punishment while in jail. These arrests mirrored the arrest of Susan B. Anthony back in 1872, who had the temerity to try to vote in the presidential election that year. But that attempt to silence her backfired, as it only brought more attention to the cause. As a Quaker, Susan had always believed in equal rights for all people, of all genders and races, and she traveled the country giving speeches on this subject, written by her collaborator, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two also founded the publication that they brazenly called The Revolution. Finally, in January of 1918, President Wilson announced his support of women's suffrage, and it was only a matter of time before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution would pass. But still, not without more struggle. Only 15 states had granted women's suffrage at the time. What followed was 2 years of increasingly vociferous protests, with women burning copies of the president's speeches in front of the White House, and even more arrests and mistreatments. But the groundswell toward suffrage had taken off and was not to be denied. Trivia time. What was the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment? On August 26, 1920, Governor A.H. Roberts of Tennessee signed the ratification document, making voting rights for women the law of the land. This should be the end of the story, but sadly, voting rights are still under attack in some corners of the country. In 2018, for example, a voter ID law was passed in North Dakota, requiring all voters to have a street address. The catch was that there were only few street names or addresses on the Indian reservations. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld that law, over the dissent of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But as with the arrest of Susan B. Anthony decades prior, it caused a backlash that resulted in a record turnout by Native American voters. Let us remember Justice Ginsburg as our most recent hero in the struggle for equal rights for women. May she rest in peace, and may her memory be a blessing.